Hello everyone, my name is Ellen and I will be presenting climate and Italian cuisine today. New York climate is extremely crucial in farming because of the extreme weather conditions New York faces. For instance, winter in New York is stretched out from October to May. Temperatures can range from below zero to freezing. Northern New York can go below zero, while southern New York can be around freezing, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Autumn, for instance, is great in New York because it is the season for harvesting. This is a great time for farm markets because business is booming. Summer, on the other hand, can get really hot. Usually, what ends up happening during this time is lots and lots of gardening. Temperatures are usually around the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Only downside of the sunshiny weather is the violent thunderstorms.
The topography of New York City heavily influenced the early settlement of colonial America. There's a lot of mountains and valleys within the New York City region. As you can see on the western side of the Hudson River, there's a lot of mountains and high elevation areas. If you also look southwest at Staten Island, you can see that Staten Island actually has a very elevated topography as well. On the other hand, Long Island is one of the flattest parts of the New York City region. There's a lot of valleys and mountains, however, the most densely populated areas within New York City are in the lowlands and valleys.
New York is a relatively diverse region of the United States. 42% of New York is white, 24%, nearly a quarter of the population, identifies as Black or African American, 13% is Asian, while 15% identify as other. That large 15% chunk of the population which identifies as other is likely due to the fact that New York is a very ethnically diverse and very dense region, where there is a lot of intermingling and mixing of different cultures and ethnicities.
So, New York is actually has quite a bit of different locally produced foodstuffs. And these foodstuffs were actually categorized into two major sections. These two sections were livestock and crops. Underneath the livestock section, about two-thirds of New York's agricultural income results from livestock and livestock products. Now, the livestock could be anywhere from any kind of animal, such as pigs, cows, chickens. And then the livestock products could be like maybe milk, eggs, beef, pork, chicken. And one of these main products was actually something I just named. It was actually milk. And New York is currently one of the third leading producers of dairy products as well. Now, underneath the crop section, New York is actually a leading fruit and vegetable producer in the eastern portion of America. New York's leading crops are apples, and which is followed then by grapes, and then the apple, cherry, and peaches are very important crops to New York as well.
New York City cuisine is a cuisine that is built upon the labor of immigrants. For example, in the early 1900s during the Industrial Revolution in the United States, many Germans came to the United States for work. This changed the entire landscape of the New York food culture because for the first time, they began eating preserved vegetables like sauerkraut and pickled beets. And these things became staples in a New Yorker's diet due to the fact that German immigrants came in such massive piles. Um, Not only did this lead to new tastes developing in the New York food scene, this also led to the iconic American staple of the hot dog stand, which not only has sauerkraut, but also has mustard, pickles, things that today are commonplace in any American pantry. These hot dog stands also have a very important role for in the lives of New Yorkers because New Yorkers have to spend a lot of time working in order to survive. And having the accessibility and the affordability of cheap meals on the go is incredibly beneficial to the people who actually live and work in New York City. But the food scene of New York City isn't only controlled by the people who live and work in the city, it is also controlled by people who eat fine dining and look for more unique culinary experiences. And New York has always been a city that is well known for its unique culinary experiences, and this is primarily due to its immigration. Since it is a city that deals so heavily with globalism and business and trade, some of the nicest restaurants and facilities for hospitality exist inside of New York City.
Moving on, we have Italian cuisine. In the mid 1800s, Italian citizens immigrated from Campania and Sicily and brought over famous Italian dishes to lower Manhattan. During this time, the famous Italian cuisine that we know today was considered exotic. Soon, in the late 1800s and 1900s, moms and pops restaurants started booming and opening business to authentic Italian restaurants. This meant that they were bringing out the red and white checkered tablecloth and everything serving hot spaghetti and meatballs or possibly a delicious pizza. One specific kind of Italian pizza is the Napoleana pizza. The Napoleana pizza must be round, soft, and fragrant. For ingredients, you would need 1 liter of water, 40 to 60 grams of salt, a third of dry yeast, and some flour. These are all mixed together. You have to make sure that the yeast and the salt do not have direct contact for more than 5 minutes. Have a consistent mixture, then leave the dough to rest covered with a damp cloth. After the dough is formed, you can start by cutting up the dough into 22 to 35 centimeter balls. After you have cut the dough into balls, you can then put them for their second round to rest. The rest period will be 8 to 24 hours. Then you have waited for your dough. You can now form your base. Now you are ready for my favorite part, the condiments. For the condiments, you would need peeled tomatoes that you can crush by hand. Finishing condiments, you would need sliced mozzarella, grated cheese, fresh basil, and extra virgin olive oil. For the best results, you would need a wood-fired oven, toasting at a heat level of 430 degrees to 480 degrees Celsius. The pizza should be ready in 60 to 90 seconds. Although we love our pizza, pizza is not the healthiest option, but it can be made healthy. Depending on the preparation, pizza can be high in fat, sodium, and of course, calories. In these cases, moderation is key. This means less meat and more veggies.
So one of the few major cuisines that actually made up New York as what it is today would be Chinese cuisine. So actually, for a little bit of background about the Chinese in New York, it wasn't until the 1870s that the Chinese immigrants began to arrive in New York in sizable numbers and what's now known as Chinatown itself. The term itself, Chinatown, was first used by the New York Times in 1880 to describe this area defined by 3 streets that still form its heart today, which is Mott, Pell, and Doyer. Some of these early Chinese New Yorkers were sailors and traders who arrived directly in New York port from China itself, maybe for trade reasons or just maybe they wanted to move to America and they just decided to stay. But many of the neighborhood's early residents arrived not from China directly, but from actually the western United States. Particularly, this was because of the anti-Chinese riots in California, specifically in San Francisco during 1877. During this time, the Chinese were actually in California in order to mine and pan for gold during the gold rush. And then some of the other Chinese people that moved over into New York were actually part of construction crews building the first transcontinental railroad, which connected basically the east to the west coast of America. Now, some of the few more famous early dishes of Chinese cuisine would be chop suey. So chop suey was kind of like a flexible thrown together stir fry, typically served with rice, but it can also be served with stir-fry noodles instead in order to create chow mein, which is more commonly known and eaten amongst Americans nowadays. Chop suey can consist of meat, which was mostly either chicken, fish, beef, shrimp, or pork, and it was also cooked with eggs it was also cooked quickly with vegetables such as bean sprouts, cabbage, and celery, and this was usually bound by a stark thickened sauce in order to just make it more cohesive. Another dish that was really popular in early Chinese cuisine and actually is quite well known today is egg foo young. Egg foo young is basically a wok fried omelet full of Chinese vegetables and sometimes meat or seafood. After it's cooked, it would be served with European style brown gravy, and then it would be served on top of just a bed of rice.
Another major New York City cuisine comes from the Irish immigrants to America. Prior to the Irish coming to America, back home in Ireland, the farmers would salt cure brisket and export it to Europe and to the United States as a form of money in the economy. However, since they were always exporting brisket, Irish people didn't actually eat brisket because it was too expensive. Instead, they ate the pork and pigs that they raised. So, actually, this corned beef and boiled cabbage dish is an Irish American cuisine dish, which truly makes it a New York City dish. The traditional Irish dish that from Ireland that influenced this dish is actually salted bacon and boiled cabbage. However, when the Irish immigrants came to America, they were able to afford beef because it was more accessible and cheaper in the United States. So, Irish Americans started having salted cured brisket and boiled cabbage instead of their salted bacon and boiled cabbage that they used to have back home in Ireland. In order to prepare this dish of salted cured brisket and boiled cabbage, first you need to salt and cure the brisket, which takes a little while to do. After you've salted and cured the brisket, you will need to braise it in some liquid in order to tenderize it. The main spices within this Irish American dish is bay leaves, allspice, and cloves. After you braise the brisket for about 45 minutes, you remove it from the braising liquid and you add your potatoes and carrots and eventually your cabbage into that braising liquid in order to incorporate all the flavors and to tenderize your vegetables. Once the vegetables are cooked, you will slice your brisket against the grain in order to keep it as tender as possible, and then you will serve the brisket with the boiled vegetables. Some people like to have the braising liquid to make a stew out of, or you can just omit it as well. The only unhealthy part about this dish would be that beef and bacon are not considered healthy proteins. Although they are very high in protein due to the cholesterol and other fats in the meats, they are not considered to be healthy proteins. However, other than that, this dish is considered relatively healthy since the vegetables are boiled and there's not a lot of other dairy or trans fats or saturated fats.
So now we're moving on to Jewish cuisine in New York City. So the first dish I'm going to talk about is matzo ball soup, which is the picture on the right. So basically, it's considered one of the most important dishes in all of Jewish culture. So the whole story behind it is that in the Torah, it explains that when the Jews left Egypt to escape slavery, they didn't have time for their bread to rise, to leaven. So they would use matzah meal, the matzah meal that they had left, and create a new way of eating from the meal. And in turn, they created matzo ball soup. It was easy to make. It didn't require too much time, and it was very convenient, basically. So what this has to do with New York City? So basically, when Jewish immigrants came to America around the late 1800s, early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, they brought over matzo ball soup. They also brought over pastrami on rye, which I'll explain later, which is the other picture on the left. But anyway, they brought matzo ball soup because it was so important to their Jewish heritage and and their religious beliefs. It was very, very important, and it was comfort food. So it was easy to make and it was really hard to find because if you're an immigrant, no one's really selling it. So they would sell it at delis, which later opened, and it was then shared with everyone. It's now considered a New York City staple in food. It's very delicious. I've tried it myself. So now we're gonna move on to pastrami on rye. Now, in Jewish culture, in Judaism, it's required that you can't eat an animal that has been slaughtered, like that isn't kosher. So basically, kosher means that all the blood has to be drained out from the animal before consumption, before cooking, or else it's considered dirty in a sense. There's another word for it. It's not on the top of my head right now. But anyway, pastrami is basically made from a kosher, like a cow that has been slaughtered with by every kosher law there is. So the meat has been cured. It's there's been a dry rub put on it. It's boiled. It's re-smoked. It's a very long process. Anyway, the end result is a nice pink brisket that you can cut up really thin and put on rye bread. Now, this was also, like I mentioned earlier, this is also brought by Jewish immigrants in a sense to have kosher food with them in America because it wasn't too available, and it's traditionally eaten in New York City. It's traditionally eaten on 2 slices of rye bread with mustard or sauerkraut or any other condiment. Yeah. So yeah, those are 2 staples in Jewish cuisine in New York City.
Eastern European cuisine has made a significant impact on not just world cuisine, but specifically New York cuisine. Large waves of Eastern European immigration happened in New York from the 1800s onward, which include large populations of Jewish people. But it's hard to define Eastern European cuisine as Jewish because it's almost an entirely different cuisine on its own. One of the staple foods of Eastern European cuisine is goulash, which became common among herders of sheep in the 9th century. One of the most interesting things about goulash is that it has actually been recognized by Auguste Escoffier in his Le Guide culinaire, which was written in 1904, giving it much credence and making it very popular among fine dining restaurants in New York. The 2 most important ingredients to make goulash is caraway seeds and paprika. The difference between paprika that is produced in Hungary versus paprika that is produced in Spain is that Hungarian paprika is much more pungent and less smoky. It has been described as much more spicy, and this is because the pith of the pepper, the white part, is intentionally left inside. Another key component to this dish is onions, as after the beef is seared, it is further braised with chicken stock and onions. Then, once the stock has made the beef tender, the broth is further seasoned with the paprika, caraway seeds, black pepper, marjoram, thyme, and cayenne pepper.